everybody. I'm going to be teaching homeostasis. Okay, so homeostasis is the ability of the body to maintain stable conditions internally when external conditions change. It's how we regulate and make sure that we don't die because of external factors. Important note, internally is referring to the fluid in our cells because that's what we can change. So, we're going to start out with some simple things to remember. We have normal range, which is 98 degrees Fahrenheit to 100 degrees. That's our safe zone. If you start getting out of that, bad things start happening. But the average is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. Blood sugar is 85 and extracellular sodium is 142. And these are what we refer to as our set points that we try to homeostasis, keep things around that set point. So, let's see here. So, let's talk about what our body can do to stay in that homeostasis area. So, if we want to stay warm, there's several things we can do. We can increase our metabolism, get our body working faster, burning energy, which gives off heat. We can divert blood to the organs because if you are getting super, super cold, your body is in like survival mode, and so all of the blood from your limbs is going to go to saving what's most important. You can probably lose an arm and a leg and be semi-okay, but you can't lose your organs, so it's going to save that. You can start to shiver, which generates body heat. If you want to stay cold, you sweat like a sinner in church. Okie dokie, so how does our body know that we need to stay within the set point that we have established? We have receptors, which are sensors that monitor the environment and let us know what's going on. So these receptors send stimuli, which is the charge, to the control centers, and those are the people who make the decisions, who are in charge. I like control centers. Anyways, they dictate actions. So effectors are what then come from the control centers. So effectors are what correct the deviations. So these are the warriors. So our big effectors are skeletal muscles, sweat glands, and blood vessels. And there's two different routes we can take for this. So you've got afferent and efferent. Afferent is toward the control center. I remember this because, and I will always love you. And it wants to be close to you. Anyways, efferent is like, ew, stay away from me. And it is telling it to go away from the control center. And did you know that both control centers, you know what that means? The hypothalamus. That's where all of this action is going on. So let's give you an example of homeostasis. So you have positive and negative feedback. Negative feedback is when you're in, you want to be around that set point, and so your body's going to constantly be correcting itself. So your body is never going, so if this is our set point, your body's never going to like follow that set point exactly. It's going to stay within the healthy ranges and be constantly correcting itself. So if you start to bleed during a surgery, for instance, your body's going to take certain measures to make sure that you don't die, and it's going to try to keep you as best as it can within that set point. Now, those are the negative. The positive feedback systems that we have, those are a little bit different. Those feed off of each other. So a good example of this is oxytocin. When you're giving birth, the oxytocin comes in and it keeps telling the body to contract and go crazy and get the baby out, and it just keeps going and going and going until something else comes in and tells it to stop. So it just wants to go way off into the rafters. Okay, so let's talk about some of these different things in real life application. We have peripheral resistance. So when you increase the peripheral resistance, you get an increase in vasoconstriction, so your blood vessels are starting to constrict, and that in turn increases your blood pressure. And the inverse is also true. Same thing with increased blood pressure increases your blood volume, and inverse, decreased blood pressure decreases your blood volume. And then your heart rate increases, when your heart rate increases, your blood pressure increases, and the inverse of that is true. Okie dokie, we talked about negative and positive. Feed forward response is a little bit different. It's an anticipating response. So what happens is your body sometimes in certain situations is like, oh my gosh, hey, I know that something bad's going to happen, so I am going to up my set point or move that around to save itself, because that's what we do. We save ourselves. Redundancy is when you have so many different signals coming from different places to achieve the same goal, because it's so important. Your organs are so important that you can't just have one pathway telling things what to do, because if something happens to that pathway, no more organs. So you need lots telling you what to do. Okay, that brings us to our feedback response loop. So you're going to have a variable, and like we talked about earlier, variable is kind of where your receptors go, oh hey, something's going on. So you got a variable that is saying, hey, I'm here, and you can have positive or negative variables. So then the receptor senses it, and it measures how wacky it is. And then you get an afferent signal, which carries, and we talked about, I will always love you. It's going to go right back to where it needs to tell, to the control center, that something's going on. And it's measured by that. Okay, so then we're to the control center. This is where we receive the info. It's the brains. And it sends out an efferent signal, which is ew, away. Signal from the control center carried to the effector. And the effector is what is being influenced. So it influences the value of the variable so that it can take action. And it just keeps going around and around and around. Okay, diffusion. We have two different types of diffusion. Diffusion is equilibrium of different solutes or particles within a solvent. So we have passive transport and we have active transport. Passive transport, they're just a bunch of lazy bums and they don't require any energy. And active transport, these are the hard workers. They require lots of energy. So we have simple diffusion, so no need for transport proteins. And it's mostly just a random movement. So that equilibrium that we just mentioned, it's just kind of happenstance. They start to equal out. However, we're going to actually skip down here. We have different things that can go against their concentration gradient, which is why we need energy to do that, because things don't want to go against their concentration gradient. Things don't like changing, so you need to input energy to make that happen. So carrier proteins can help with this. They cause a conformational shift to occur, and that moves this. It's kind of like a revolving door. It moves the solutes into the cell. Active transport, like we talked about, loves energy. So you have two different types. You have E1 and E2 forms. So for the E1, you have binding sites for ATP intracellularly, and then for E2, they're extracellularly. And this shows we've got not a semi-permeable membrane. Anyways, phospholipid bilayer membrane, and you've got your circa pump or your sodium-potassium pump, and it's showing how certain things can come in this case sodium, and other things can come out, potassium, and it's showing that it's taking ATP to make that happen. It's taking that energy that we talked about. So secondary transport kind of runs off of active transport, and there's two different types. There's symport, which means they're both going the same direction, and then there's antiport, which means they're going opposite directions. So secondary can't take place without active. It's just kind of hitching a ride. Okie dokie, back up here. So there's several different things we need to know about. In order to control the speed of this diffusion, it's determined by mass, molecular weight, and solubility. So this lovely equation, J equals negative dA, blah, 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 blah. Anyways, we're going to go through what that actually means. So J is the net rate of diffusion. That's what we're trying to change. D in this equation equals the diffusion coefficient, and then A equals the surface area. So depending on how much area you're determining within your membrane is the A. And then the change of C, or delta C, is the concentration difference. So when you increase the concentration difference, molecules want to rush to an area that's less concentrated. So if you have a ton of particles, they are going to want to go to areas of less. So if you increase that, there's even more that want to get out. And anyways, that's how you increase that. And then delta X is the thickness of the membrane. So if a membrane is super, super thick, it's harder to get through and you have to do more work. Okie dokie. So we're going to talk about facilitated diffusion now. So you have 3 different types of proteins that help with that. You have voltage-gated, ligand-gated, and mechanically gated. So voltage-gated is created by voltage changes. So the concentration creates that voltage change and then thus creating voltage channels. Anyways, ligand, they're a little bit different. So what happens is they have a specific site for a ligand to bind in a specific location to make that work. And then mechanically gated channels are where pressure, touch, or change in temperature determines what can go through there. And they are just keeping stuff out until the right things come along, and then whoop, they get in. Okie dokie, so now we're going to talk about bulk transport. So we have endocytosis and exocytosis. Endocytosis is bringing into the cell, endo like endoscopies, so inside, gross. And then you have exocytosis, which is like, get out of my cell. And so it's bringing things outside of the cell. So here are some different types of endocytosis. Phagocytosis is when the cell is eating, and this takes place mainly in immune cells. So they have to eat a lot of crap to figure out and protect us from nasty diseases. So here we've got our little cell, and you have pseudopodia that come in and they just kind of like chomp chomp, and they eat it up, and now you have all the good stuff inside to figure out what's going on with it. Now we have penocytosis, which is drinking, cell drinking, and this mainly happens in the intestines and the kidneys, which makes sense because that's where all of our water is stored. So what happens here is you've got all of your particles, and the cell kind of just engulfs it, and as it's kind of closing, it forms a vesicle, and then the vesicle's pinched off and it's put in the cell, and these then become clathrin surrounded. Okay, receptor mediated. These ones are super, super picky eaters. So they have little hands that are out like feeling, going, hey, what do I actually want to eat? And which are receptors. And so certain things have to bind to them to allow the particles to enter, and then same thing, engulfs it, pinches it off, and then you have a clathrin coated vesicle. Exocytosis, the getting them outside of the cell. Secretory vesicles, so the vesicle comes up and it kind of just like bloop into oblivion, and you can get rid of nasty stuff that you don't want in the cell that way. Okay, I really hope that worked. Thank you very much. We will see you next time.
Hello, we're going to be talking about osmosis today and all the things associated with that. So first of all, we have to know what osmosis is. Osmosis is water movement. More importantly, it's water movement between the ICF and ECF, or our intracellular fluid and our extracellular fluid. And it must occur through cell membranes. Now, cell membranes are not permeable to water, so how does the water get in? Well, I can answer that. They get in through aquaporins, or protein water channels that are specifically designed to let water in. And what causes this water movement? Well, that's driven by osmotic pressure gradient. Osmotic pressure gradient is the pressure sufficient to prevent water from moving across the membrane. So it's keeping things where they're supposed to be. Now, what causes this osmotic pressure gradient is going to be our solute gradient. So what makes a solute? Let's start with that. So ions plus molecules give us our solutes. And then that gradient is it's always high to low for our water potential, or also known as the solute concentration, because water wants to go where the party is, or where there's more stuff, or solutes. So it's going to move to where there's more stuff. So the greater the amount of stuff, the more it wants to hang out at the party. Now, there is a difference between osmolarity and molarity. So that solute concentration is referring to the osmolarity, or the number of particles per liter of solution. Whereas molarity is talking about the numbers of molecules per liter of solution. Now, osmolarity and tonicity are very important in understanding what happens within the cell. So osmolarity is going to have numbers of units, whereas tonicity is not, because it is talking about what's happening in the cell. So for example, osmolarity is like this diagram right here. We have our solution and the cell. Now, osmolarity is referring to them separate. So the numbers of what's inside the solution versus the cell. Now, for tonicity, it's talking about the solution and the cell together and what the solution is going to cause the cell to do. So let's talk about that a little bit. Before we get into that, though, we need to know the three different types for each osmolarity and tonicity. So we have iso, which means the same, and then we have hyper, which means more, and hypo, which means less. So I like to think of it as hyper kids always have more candy, and hypo are sad, chubby kids who don't get the candy. Anyways, that's how I remember it. So let's start with osmolarity. So if you have a hyperosmotic solution, let's come over to this right here and we'll kind of show. So if you have a hyperosmotic solution, that means you have more solutes than in your cell. So that's going to be hyper. Now, if you have hypo, you're going to have less than what's in your cell. And iso means you have the same amount, so there's equilibrium there. So for tonicity, this is a little bit different. We're going to show you what it looks like for tonicity with this. So hypertonic means that you have water rushing out of the cell because there's more stuff on the outside than the inside. So the water's woo, don't fall over. Okay, we're going to scoot this back. There we go. The water is coming out of the solution. It's going to stay. This isn't going to stay. There we go. Okay, the water is coming out of the cell, making the cell shrink and become smaller. Now, for an isotonic solution with the cell, or what's happening with isotonicity, is where you have the same amount. So the water's not going to go anywhere. It's stagnant because it doesn't have that gradient causing it to move. Whereas with hypotonic solutions, it's going to be a little bit different what happens to the cell. So if you have hypotonicity of the cell, that means you're going to have more particles on the inside. So water is going to rush in, causing that cell to expand to take in all that water. So we're going to go through different scenarios now of what that might look like for some different solutions. Okay, so first of all, we need to know some constants. So inside the cell is always supposed to be 300. Now, 0.9% saline is also 300, and 5% dextrose is always 300. So if we have a 0.9% saline solution, that means we also have the same amount of solutes, and so that's going to cause it to be isoosmotic and isotonic. Whereas 5% dextrose is a little different, because even though in here it's going to be isoosmotic because it's the same, as soon as it enters the cell, it gets eaten really quickly. So if I have, we're going to use 4 dots to show how much is in the cell. Oh, this isn't working very well. Okay, where were we? We have 4 dots showing how many solutes are in the cell. Now, if you have 5% dextrose, what happens is you have those 4 dots, but they're going to get eaten away really quickly. So water is going to rush into the cell, causing it to be hypotonic and to grow. Now, for our next scenario, we're going to have 5% dextrose and 0.9% saline. So this one is going to be a little bit different. So let's start with up here. We're going to use dots to show what I'm trying to talk to you about. There we go. Okay, so we have 4 dots representing what's normally inside our cell. Now the solution, you've got 4 of the dextrose, and you have an additional 4 of the saline. Now looking at that, you're going to go, oh, there's more stuff outside of the cell than inside the cell. So that's going to be hyperosmotic. But when you put them together, remember that you have 300 in the cell, but the dextrose gets eaten, leaving you with just the 4 or the same solutes as the saline. So that's going to be isotonic. Now, what if you were to, there we go, have 0.45% saline? That's half of the regular amount. So if you only have 2 dots compared to the regular 4 dots, you're going to have a hypoosmotic solution because the water is going to want to go where there's more stuff and come into the cell. Or, excuse me, hypoosmotic, yes, correct. Okay, anyways, and then you're going to have hypotonic because, once again, if you have 2 dots out here, it's going to rush in, causing the cell to swell. Okay, last one, if you have 0.45% saline and 5% dextrose, you're going to add an additional 4 little dots here, making the water want to move out. So this has more stuff than inside the cell, making it hyperosmotic. And then if you put them together, remember, dextrose always gets eaten, and so it's still going to be a hypotonic solution, and you're still going to have water going into the cell. So hopefully that kind of makes a little bit of sense. We are now going to kind of jump back over and talk about this osmolarity versus solute versus the volume. So osmolarity can be determined by this equation, and it's O equals solute over volume. And then you're going to have your dissociation constant, or I, which is going to apply to different equations later on. So we have to do some calculations when using osmolarity. So you set up your graph or table like this, and you're going to have what you originally start out with before equilibrium and after equilibrium. So for this example, we're taking the intracellular fluid, extracellular fluid, and then the total. So if you were to start regular cell, 300 milliosmoles, we're going to put those all for our first row, or first column, excuse me. And then let's say the intracellular fluid has got 2 liters, the extracellular fluid has 3 liters, making the total 5 liters. You can do the math from there. So if you take 2 times 300, or the volume times the osmolarity, you get the solution, or how much stuff is inside. So to describe this, a good analogy is you have a great big cooler full of red Kool-Aid. If you take a cup out of it and compare the two, obviously the cup is going to have less volume than the great big cooler. However, the concentration is going to be the same because it's the same amounts of red Kool-Aid in the water, like same ratio, I guess, for the cup and the cooler. Now, but if you were to ask me how much sugar, which one has more sugar in it, the answer is going to be the cooler because you're looking at the whole thing overall. So that's referring to our solute. So now we do the math. So 2 times 300, we have 600 for intracellular fluid, and then 3 times 300 is going to be 900 for the extracellular fluid, leaving us with 1500 for the total. So that's a good place to start. But now let's say we add another liter of solution in that's of a different osmolarity. And we just have example numbers in here for right now. So let's say I add a liter to the extracellular fluid. That then changes my total volume to 6. And all of this needs to be arranged because if I add water, that's going to be a different osmolarity than what's already in there. And now you have to figure out the osmolarity of them together. So this intracellular fluid's osmolarity is still going to be the same, but the other two are now going to be different. So you solve for the osmolarity, and that goes in the extracellular fluid box so that you can now solve the others. Now, you're going to want the average of both osmolarities for your new constant of what your osmolarity is going to be after equilibrium. So then you plug in the constant. For this example, it's 250 instead of 300, now goes in for our new constant osmolarity. And you want to find how many liters are now like in the different sections for where your solute is going. So your solutes are going to stay the same as they were before because you haven't added more sugar. The sugar's the same. You just want to know where stuff is now. So you can now take 600 divided by 250 is going to give you 2.4 liters, and then 900 divided by 250 is 3.6 liters. And you still have a total of 6 liters. That hasn't changed. So that's how you kind of figure out the osmolarity and the liters and the solution of your different stuff in different scenarios that you may have. It is important to remember that 1 mole of glucose equals 1 osmol, and then 1 mole of sodium chloride equals 1.6 osmol. Okie dokie, so now we're going to go on to resting membrane potential. And that is the potential of having an electrical charge, and that's established by the ATPase pump. So the ATPase pump is also known as the sodium-potassium pump. So what happens is you have 3 sodium that want to leave the cell because you've got a higher concentration of sodium outside the cell. So it's going to want to move. And then you have 3 sodiums coming in the cell and 2 potassium moving out, because there's more potassium inside the cell than outside the cell. And this is different than osmolarity. So instead of going to where there's more stuff, the ions are not as big of fans of parties, and they want to go into smaller social circles. They want to go where there's less amount of stuff. So for our ATPase pump, you've got 3 sodium coming into the cell at the same time as 2 coming out. And that happens through conformational shift, where it's kind of like a revolving door. When 3 sodiums come in, it changes shape, kicks them out, and now it can accept 2 potassium, and then it takes that up, lets them out, changes shape, and does the whole thing over again. And this is what determines our electrochemical gradient and our resting membrane potential. So let's kind of show you what that might look like a little bit. So this is just a graph of charge over time. So the resting membrane potential is where it's going to be at its resting state. So that's by this line here. Now, if you have got more negative charge coming into the cell, that's going to cause your potential to what we call hyperpolarize, or to go down further away from the threshold or from what's known as the resting state too. And then if it is to go more positive or towards the threshold, that's going to be called depolarization. And then if it's coming from an area past or at the threshold down back to the resting state, that's called repolarization. And this can kind of be described too in this graph as well. So we have 2 tanks, and there is a potassium permeable membrane in between. So you have tank A and tank B. Now in tank B, you have a bunch of chloride ions that are negatively charged over here. And then you have potassium. Now the potassium is going to want to go where there's less potassium. So it's going to cross over. However, it wants to stay at a constant. And so as there is potassium coming over, there is also potassium moving back into that side B. So let's move on to what allows these things to move across the membrane. So we have different protein channels. We have leak channels and we have gated channels. Leak channels are open most of the time. They're leaky. And gated channels are like the gated community. They don't open all the time, only to special people who they dictate who they are. So you have voltage, mechanical, or chemically or ligand gated channels. Voltage is self-explanatory. It opens according to the voltage that's coming in. Mechanical is determined by pressure, temperature, different things that say, hey, you need to open. So those are our 3 types. And excitable cells' resting membrane potential is -50 to -85 millivolts, and this is for skeletal muscles or neurons. So that's a lot lower for these things that are needing to go fast, to have a lot of speed. Non-excitable cells' resting membrane potential is -5 to -10, and an example of that is red blood cells. So let's talk some more about this electrochemical gradient that's driving stuff. And this can be described through the Nernst equation. And the Nernst equation can predict the equilibrium potential of any ion. And it's this equation right here. So it's E equals -61.5 over Z, which in our case ends up being 1, log of what's coming in the cell divided by outside the cell. So we have our lovely little cell here, and we have a sodium voltage gated channel. We have a calcium gated voltage gated sodium channel, calcium voltage gated channel, and then we have a potassium voltage gated channel. Now, like we talked about earlier, potassium is higher inside the cell, and so it wants to move outside of the cell to the ECF. And here's our little sodium-potassium pump, and that's driven by ATP like we talked about earlier in the previous video, and that's the energy that drives that. Another thing to note, the Nernst equation does not include permeability, so it's 100% permeable, and we are talking about one ion. Okay, we're going to jump back over to what is driving force, and that's what's causing all these others. So driving force equals the Vm minus Ex. So Ex stands for the equilibrium potential, and the Vm stands for the voltage of the membrane, which for most of our examples is going to be -70. So let's talk about the 3 different types of driving forces. We have our sodium, which is -174 millivolts, and then we've got potassium, which is +15 millivolts, and then we have chloride, which is +9 millivolts. And the sodium has a positive ion charge, and the potassium has a positive ion charge, but we all know that chloride has got the negative charge. So what is this going to do? This is going to cause our direction of sodium to move towards the inside of the cell, because we have all of these negative charges along the inside and we want to exchange them for positives. And there's less sodium in the cell, so that's where it wants to go. And then potassium wants to move towards the outside, like we talked about earlier. There's more potassium inside the cell than outside, so it wants to move outside. And then chloride ions want to move towards the inside of the cell, because there is less of them. So I hope you enjoyed, and we will talk more about these principles in the next video.
Hello, we are going to talk about action potentials. So to start off, action potentials have got a resting membrane potential. And for neurons, that starts at -70. We also have what we call a threshold. So in neurons, what happens is we have this -70 and we have all these potassium leak channels. Now, this doesn't mean that potassium wants to come into the cell. It just means that it wants to leave it a little bit less, because leak channels don't have a gate, so they're just open. They don't get to control whether it goes in or out. But the gradient does, which we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, then we get to calcium is another important ion in this scenario, because calcium sets the threshold of where our action potential is going to start off and going to kick off. So in order for our action potential to kick off, we have to have a voltage-gated sodium channel open. So once those open, our action potential can run, and then it hits the top where those voltage-gated sodium channels close, and right about this period is where our potassium voltage-gated channels open. And this is going to cause our cell to repolarize, because we depolarized going away from the threshold, and now we're coming back down towards it. So our action potential is going to come down, and then because you have both leak channels and the voltage-gated potassium channels open at the same time, it's going to cause this hyperpolarization. So these start to close right about threshold, and then it takes that minute for them to close because there's both open. And then you reestablish your resting membrane potential with your action potential, and from here on you can start more action potentials. So that moves us into the next section of whether it's an absolute refractory period or a relative refractory period. Absolute refractory period is when you absolutely cannot start another action potential, whereas relative refractory period is the hyperpolarization, so it potentially can restart in that period from here to here. Okay, so changes in resting potential either cause our action potentials or they cause graded potentials. So graded potentials result from the opening of mechanical or ligand-gated channels, and they can be added to increase the charge, and then the amplitude is determined by the number of channels open. So to explain that, you're not actually, graded potentials kind of just build on each other. They don't actually set off an action potential. So you can have depolarization and hyperpolarization of this as well. And this is shown in this graph. It comes along in depolarization, you come up, and then it comes back down. You hit threshold and you can't create an action potential. And then hyperpolarization, same thing, you're coming along and you dip down just like in this graph, and then you can dip back up to the -70 or our resting membrane potential. Okay, so now we're going to go over capacitance. So capacitance also is referring to how permeable the membrane is, and we describe that through this equation. So C equals Q divided by V, so charge divided by volts. And to kind of explain this, we're talking about the space in between the charges. So because these are so close together in this membrane, it's got a high capacitance because you've got lots of charges working against each other. Whereas if you were to increase the space between the two, the attraction isn't as strong, and that lowers your capacitance. So Rm is our membrane resistance and Ri is our internal resistance. So this also refers to this. So membrane resistance is referring to how thick the membrane is and how hard the membrane is to get across that. Internal resistance has more to do with the resistance of our Wang hitting different charges within here. So if they're spaced, if there's less of them or they're spaced further apart, it's going to be easier for the action potential to work its way down the axon, which is why with myelin, it helps that because it separates it out and it makes it easier for things to move down the axon faster. Okay, so time constant is Rm times Cm, and that is the exponential loss in current across time. So obviously time constant. And then length constant has to do with the distribution in space, which can be described using the equation lambda equals Rm divided by Ri, the square root of all of that. Okay, we're going to move on to our axons. So this is what we call the cell body, and this whole thing is the soma, and then we have these little dendrites. And then we have our axon hillock, where we have an increased amount of sodium channels, voltage-gated sodium channels. And then this is our axon. And then these fat encapsulated areas are called our myelin sheath. And then the space in between, those are called the node of, or nodes of Ranvier. And then we have our axon terminals. So to kind of describe what's going on, you're going to have different, oops, wrong way. We're going to have different inputs coming in, and then they're going to be received by our dendrites, and the dendrites take that information back to our cell body, and then they propagate those signals down the channel, where then these can come in and do the same thing, where they give input to more dendrites and it sends off more information. So a smaller version of this is our sending neuron, or presynaptic, and our postsynaptic, or our receiving neuron. And the space in between these two is called the synaptic cleft. And what happens is you have a neurotransmitter that comes down. It's encapsulated in a vesicle. The vesicle comes in and it's captured by snare proteins, which attach and then they twist, bringing it closer to the surface. And then the neurotransmitter is released and the vesicle is dissolved. Now that the neurotransmitter is in between the gap or the synaptic cleft, it is free to come and bind to the receptor site on our different channels that we have. So in this case, our first channel is the AMPA, which glutamate has to come in and bind to that for this to open. Now we have another channel that we're going to talk about, which is the NDMA. And that has a magnesium stuck on the inside, preventing anything from coming in or out. But what happens is we have a calcium that comes in, knocks it out, allowing potassium to enter and exit the cell through this channel. And the calcium, what it does is the positive charges swell the dendrite, which decreases our internal resistance. We also have metabolizing enzymes that are helping create, they're taking these enzymes and turning them into our neurotransmitters. Okie dokie. So depolarizing, like on our graph, is also known as excitatory postsynaptic potentials, and those are always going to be positive. And then we have our hyperpolarizing, which is inhibitory postsynaptic potentials, or IPSPs, and those are negative. And there's two different types of summation, or how our BWOG is going. And there's temporal summation, which has to do with timing. It's how quickly the signal is being sent out. And then spatial summation is how many EPSPs to one dendrite. So if you have one that's sending lots of signals really quickly, that's our temporal. If you have many different input and signal coming into one dendrite, it may not be as quickly, but you've got a lot coming in through just that one dendrite. Okay, we're going to move on to driving force. So driving force is Vm, or whatever the resting membrane potential is. So for our example, we're going to say it's -70 minus the Nernst equation. So we're going to jump down to the Nernst equation really quickly. The Nernst equation is E equals -61.5 divided by Z, which the Z is also the charge of the ion that you're working with, times log of in and out. So what that means is you're going to take the number of the concentration in the cell and out the cell for those numbers, and then apply it. And that is to determine the difference between the electrochemical gradient and just the regular gradient. And that tells you where things wants to move in the cell. Does it want to move in or out of the cell? And three things that you need to know about the Nernst equation are, it doesn't include permeability, which in other words makes it 100% permeable, and then it's only dealing with one ion at a time. Okay, so for our driving force, what's going to take place is we have a higher concentration of potassium inside the cell than outside the cell. So we know that with regular concentration gradients, it's going to want to come out, but sometimes this can be a little different depending on the chemical gradient, and that's where our Nernst equation comes into play. So to simplify this a little bit, if our driving force is positive, that's going to mean that for cations, they want to move out of the cell. And if for cations our driving force is negative, then it's going to want to come into the cell. And then for anions, it's the opposite. So if an anion's driving force is positive, then it's going to want to come into the cell, and then vice versa, negative to. Okay, we will see you next time.
Hey everybody, today we're going to be talking about the nervous system. So we've got it divided up into several different categories. So we're going to start first with the CNS, or the CNS, or the central nervous system, and that is referring to the brain and the spinal cord. And then we have the other off branch. So everything else that we're going to talk about falls under the PNS, or the peripheral nervous system. And that is split into two different things. You have the autonomic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. So the somatic nervous system has to do with sensory and motor, so it's where it's more referring to the outside of your body, sensing what's going on and saying, hey, we are being burned on fire, move your hand, kind of situation. And then we have, under the autonomic nervous system, there's another two. You have sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic is fight or flight, and parasympathetic is rest and digest. So there's some different things that we need to know in relationship to these two things. So common things that happen or are controlled by the sympathetic nervous system are you're going to increase your heart rate, because you're thinking about, like, if you're being chased by a bear, what's going to happen is an easier way to think about this. So increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, you're going to get goosebumps. You're going to have mydriasis, you're going to have bronchial dilation, so you get more oxygen and air into your lungs to be able to go and run. And then you have increased blood flow to cardiac and skeletal muscles. So your appendages are going to get a lot more blood flow than your organs so that they can work faster to get you away from the danger. Whereas with parasympathetic, you're going to have decreased heart rate, you're going to have decreased blood pressure, decreased respiration, meiosis, increased salivation, increased lacrimation, increased urination, and increased defecation. So your body is working to rest and digest. So everything's going to be going to your organs more than your appendages. Okie dokie. So another thing that we need to know is with the sympathetic nervous system, it's got a short preganglionic and long postganglionic cell neuron. Gee whiz. And then with parasympathetic, you've got a long pre and a short post. And with the sympathetic, it is located from T1, or the thoracic T1 vertebrae, to the lumbar L2 to L3 in the spinal cord. Okay, now we're going to jump over to some more important things. So we have 4 different diagrams, and this is depicting the spinal cord. And in here, and then you've got your vertebrae. Within the spinal nerve pathway, what happens is you have a neuron that's coming out, and it's got a receptor on the end, and then midway in the dorsal root ganglion has got the kind of the brain of that neuron, and it continues sending information either way. And then you've got the somatic sensory, which brings information or stimuli from the outside and takes it back to the spinal nerve. So the pathway is used both ways, if that makes sense. And then the somatic, that is the somatic sensory, Somatic motor is you've got an impulse that comes down and then it hits the second part of the neuron, which has receptors that lead to muscle. And that's the somatic motor. And this creates a spinal nerve. And spinal nerves only go to skin, not cavities, which is important to remember. We're going to move on to the sympathetic nerve pathway. So what is important in this is we are going to be talking about the sympathetic chain ganglion. So out of the lateral horn of our spinal cord, you're going to have a neuron that comes, and then it synapses in the sympathetic chain ganglion. And then you have that secondary neuron that comes, and it controls things above the diaphragm. Now we have our splanchnic nerve pathway, which it comes out of the dorsal root, and it comes down, and it synapses in what's called the collateral ganglia. And then it spreads out below the diaphragm. Okay, now we have a special one. It's my favorite one. It's the adrenal medullary gland pathway. So it has the splanchnic nerve as before, but instead of coming out and synapsing in the collateral ganglia, it stays as one whole, and it goes to the adrenal gland, where then epinephrine is released into the blood system. Okie dokie. So we're going to turn that a little bit. Let's move on to kind of more of what's taking place in a blown up picture. So the sympathetic nervous system, like we said before, has a short preganglionic, long postganglionic, and the neurotransmitter that's going to transmit between these two with this first junction is ACH, or acetylcholine. And within each of these is ACH-ACE inhibitor, so it's eating up everything there. Anyways, and what is receiving that ACH or being what's coming in and binding to it, or what the ACH is coming in and binding to, probably makes sense, is the N2 receptor, or the nicotinic type 2, which is an inotropic receptor. So then our signal is propagated down the post, and the neurotransmitter that is released during the second part is norepinephrine. And norepinephrine comes in and it binds to, there's 5 different types. There's alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3. Are the different types it can, but it's only going to attach to one at once. It depends on what it's attaching to is what has the receptor. So this can be smooth muscle, cardiac, or glands. Now, for the second part of this, there's a different deviation for general sweat glands. Same thing happens up until this second synapse. Instead of norepinephrine, it's the ACH again, and it's going to bind to M1, which is an adrenergic receptor, or metabotropic, which is your catecholamines that we will come back and discuss here in a second. PNS, peripheral nervous system, like we said, has the long presynaptic and then short postsynaptic. Once again, we have ACH as the neurotransmitter from the pre to the post, and a nicotinic type 2 receptor. And then the other change is that you have ACH as your secondary, as with the sweat glands. But this one is going to have muscarinic or cholinergic receptors that are on its target tissues, which are M1, M2, M3, M4, M5. Okie dokie. So first of all, we need to learn a little bit more about, I'll skip forward, about what these different things do. So M1, M3, and M5 all increase IP3, which then increases the calcium allowed into the cell. And then M2 and M4, they decrease CAMP, which is then going to decrease production of whatever is being transmitted, and it's going to destroy CAMP. Alpha 1 is going to increase IP3, and alpha 2 is going to decrease CAMP. Beta 1 and beta 2 are going to increase CAMP, and beta 1 and beta 3, are going to increase CAMP, and then beta 2 is also going to increase CAMP. So a few helpful hints is that if it's even, it's CAMP, and if it's odd, it's IP3. Also, if it's even, it's inhibitory, or if it's odd, it's excitatory. So some of these, we need to know what their common connection is to the body. So the heart is going to be a beta 1 receptor. Lung bronchi is beta 2 receptors, and those beta 2 receptors love epinephrine. And then our blood vessels are going to be alpha 1 and sometimes beta 2, and alpha 1 loves norepinephrine. Eyes, the constrictor pupillae, are going to love M1, and then the radial muscle, because there's 2 in the eyes that have these receptors, are going to be alpha 1. And then fat and adipose tissue, those are going to be beta 3 receptors. So now that we know that, we can kind of jump over here. So cholinergic receptors mean that they accept ACH. And then adrenergic, they accept adrenaline. And so these both, so they're talking about N1 or N2, and they depolarize, and then M1 through M5 all hyperpolarize the cell. And then we have our other category, which is catecholamines, and these are adrenergic receptors. So these include norepinephrine, epinephrine, and dopamine. And these things all originate from the tyrosine, which then, as that molecule changes, it becomes these other catecholamines. So alpha 1 and alpha 2 are stimulatory, and then beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3, all the betas, are inhibitory. And one last quick note, some fun facts: 75% of all of the organs in the body are innervated by the vagus nerve, which is cranial nerve 10. And atropine is a muscarinic antagonist. And then also for our dendrites that are coming off of the soma, there's several different types that we need to be aware of. So we have mushroom, as you can see, it kind of plumes out. And then we have thin, we have short, fat, and stubby, which is my personal favorite. And then we have filopodia, which is long and skinny, and then branched, which obviously branching, it comes out as 2. And the one that leads to better, longer retention and memory is the short and stubby. Those are the ones that we like. Okie dokie. We'll see you next time.